All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Samantha Runge. I am a second-year philosophy PhD student here at Notre Dame. I'm actually filling in as chair this morning for Abigail Whalen, who is also a second-year philosophy PhD student here. She just unfortunately couldn't be here this morning. But it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our panel on Aquinas and Islamic philosophy. Our first speaker today is Seth Kreeger. Seth is a PhD candidate at Marquette University and KU Leuven, working on the background to Aquinas' real distinction of essence and existence in the thought of William of Auvergne and Avicenna. He recently completed a year as a Fulbright scholar in Belgium at KU Leuven. He has published on or has forthcoming articles on Aquinas, Avicenna, Plotinus, William of Auvergne, and Tolkien. His paper today is titled Two Proximate Sources of Aquinas' Actus Essendi, William of Auvergne, and the Latin Avicenna. Let's welcome Seth.
Thank you for that. It's a pleasure to be here. So with my talk, I'm going to presume a little familiarity with Thomas Aquinas, that you know Aquinas understands existence as the act of being, the actus essendi. And that's a fair assumption, I think, at this conference, that you know this. But two proximate sources, sort of in the background of Aquinas developing his metaphysics. So this paper merely seeks to call attention to two proximate sources of Aquinas' understanding of existence as the act of being. And sort of as a definition here, from one prominent author, writes that the act of being of a singular being or existent by which it exists. So that's what existence is, that by which something exists. So the first text I'm going to look at is the Latin Avicenna's Liber de Prima Philosophia 1:7. And then the second text is, wow, that got loud. William of Auvergne's De Trinitate 6, and then the development of this argument later in De Universo 2:1:11. So first, a few things on distancing Aquinas from Avicenna, and this is very common in the literature, right? Gilson, famous here. Also, Gilson famously distanced Aquinas from Avicenna, but he also distances Aquinas from William. And I don't have enough time, I think, to talk about this. I deal with it in the paper, but I'm going to be moving on. So early in Aquinas' career, Aquinas attributes the essence-existence distinction to Avicenna. There's a number of texts in which he does this in the sentences, but just one of my favorites is the commentary on the sentences, book 1, distinction 8:1:1. But it's still often questioned, I think legitimately, whether Aquinas understands this distinction in the way Avicenna does, especially given the fact that Aquinas criticizes Avicenna on this in a few places, right? Criticizing Avicenna for regarding existence as an accident that's superadded to essence, right? This is the language of the commentary on the metaphysics. So various commentators have held different positions on Avicenna. So one view I'm going to look at here briefly is, in some sense, Avicenna does posit a distinction of essence and existence in all things other than God, but that this is not really a composition or a distinction of real ontological principles. Okay, so you could think of this debated topic in Thomistic metaphysics right now between sort of esse meaning the fact of existence, the fact that something is, versus esse meaning the act of being, the intrinsic metaphysical component. And you could think of Kevin White's article not too long ago. So this, you could say, well, Avicenna's got, this distinction in one sense, but not in another sense. Or you could see this as sort of Gilson does, that, yeah, Avicenna understands esse here, but it's in a radically deficient way. It's an accident of essence, not its actuality. So for the first view, just one author, and like medievals, they don't mention contemporaries by name. I'm just going to give you the quote. But Aquinas maintains that essence and existence should be understood as two principles of ontological constituents of concrete things, a piece of doctrine which can hardly be found in Avicenna's writing. Okay, so that's one view of Avicenna. There's a second view of Avicenna, which is Gilson's here, and he's no longer with us, so he gets mentioned by name. Avicenna considers actual existence, if not truly an accident, at least in addition to or an appendage of essence. It is its ultimate act in the sense that it comes to essence as its ultimate complement, but not as the first act which makes it to be a being. We tentatively submit that there is nothing like the Thomistic notion of an intrinsic act of being in the Avicennian notion of a possible essence that holds its necessity from another, right? So, and then Gilson says here, between Avicenna's extrinsicism, right, that existence sort of extrinsic, sort of superficially added on, and the Thomistic intrinsicism of existence, no conciliation is possible. The pass from one to the other is not an evolution, but a revolution, right? And these are not my views, just so you know, but they're prominent. So another author, living author, no name, says in this sort of very prominent work on Thomas that in his early writings, Thomas was still largely indebted to Avicenna's view of esse as accidental to the essence. Gradually, he moved away from Avicenna's essentialism towards a true metaphysics of being in which primacy is given to esse existence as the act of the essence. An important step in this direction was the applications of the Aristotelian notions of act and potency to the relationship of essence and existence, right? So the idea here is that existence is actuality and the essence is potency. So I think you should at least see that the attempts to distance Aquinas from Avicenna should be clear, right? Okay, so not so fast. I'm not debating these interpretations of Avicenna. I'm just sort of bracketing them. But I want to point out that these approaches, I think, miss how Avicenna is actually directly and indirectly in the background of Aquinas's understanding of existence explicitly as actuality, right? So this becomes especially clear, I think, when we pivot to William of Auvergne and we see how William of Auvergne is putting together his metaphysics, right? And so for the first time in the Latin tradition, I submit William of Auvergne develops an understanding of existence explicitly as the Actus Essendi and does so in clear dependence on Avicenna, right? And this helps to just point out that Aquinas isn't working in a vacuum. William of Auvergne, probably the most important man in Paris. Aquinas and William overlap in Paris from 1245 to 1248, right? So first, the text in Avicenna, my key text here from the Latin Avicenna. This is my favorite picture of Avicenna, by the way. So first, the classic text for the distinction of essence and existence in Avicenna, and Bertolocci has written on this, right? It's Metaphysics of the Healing 1.5, right? And there Avicenna distinguishes, interestingly, two senses of esse, right? That's what the Latin is here. Esse as quidditas or mahia, hakika, the essence of a thing, its reality, something like that. And then esse in the sense of, I say this as indicating actual existence, right? Something that's established in the mind or in reality. The Latin here is esse affirmative, right? Something's affirmative. And but the key text, and do you have the whole thing? Yes, I think the whole thing's up there. The one I want to look at for William here is a couple chapters later, 1.7. So here's the Latin Avicenna writes, the property of that which is a possible being is manifest from this, namely that it necessarily needs another to make it a being in act, right? Esse in effectu, befali maujudin in the Arabic. For whatever is possible in respect of itself is always a possible being, but perhaps necessary being will happen to it through another apart from itself. That necessary existence, however, occurs to it either at some time or always. That to which it occurs at some time it owes to an account of matter, which precedes it in time. But that to which it occurs always, its quiddity, and this is sort of interesting, is not simple, right? For that which it has from respect to itself is other than that which it has from another. And from these two, it acquires to be, I'm saying, that which it is, or something like that. Whence nothing is freed in every way from all potency or possibility, except the necessary being. Okay, so William of Auvergne, you've seen the key text in Avicenna. This is, I think, one of the only images we have of William of Auvergne that's sort of coming from sometime around his life. He's the guy on the right. So the scene here is Louis IX is sick and they think dying. And his mother, Blanche of Castile, is in the middle. And I think what's going on here is he's vowing to take the cross if he's recovers from his illness. And he does. He recovers and he goes on crusade a couple times, and it doesn't go super well for him. But William of Auvergne, right, on the right. Okay, so Avicenna and William of Urn's De Trinitate. So first, setting a little background, that Metaphysics of the Healing 1.5 text, I think, is pretty important for William too. So I want to talk about that briefly. In De Trinitate 2, like the Latin Avicenna, William distinguishes two senses of esse, right? So he's still using the abstract term here. And one sense means the substance or the essence of a thing and what is signified by its essential definition. So he's sort of following Avicenna and using that sort of quantitative sense of the word esse. But William says, in another sense, esse is that which indicates real existence, right? That which is indicated by the word s, as when we say Socrates is. And then I think this is sort of the only argument I've been able to find in William for the distinction of being in essence in creatures. And it's kind of like this intellectus argument that you can see in sort of similar to what Aquinas is doing in De Ente. So he says, so for whatever we imagine, whether it's a man or an ass or something else, we do not understand esse in its definition, its ratione, with one exception of which esse is said essentially, for its essence is not able to be understood except as being its ipsum esse, since it and its esse are in every way one. So the idea here, right, what he's referring to there in the second little bit of that is obviously God, right? God's essence is his existence. So going on and just sort of the next few chapters here, what William's doing in the De Trinitate is a little background. He goes on to use the essence existence distinction in creatures, I argue, to then goes on and to argue for God's existence, right? And so he does this on the basis of the fact that that's my son. His namesake is actually William of Auvergne, and so he's like, you're not talking about the best one, right? But anyway, William goes on and he argues that a thing can't be the cause of its own existence, and he rejects an infinite regress of causes, right? So that's how I see him arguing for the existence of God. And the idea here is that everything else that other than God has an existence that's acquired, and what is acquired is other than what acquires, right? And so every cause thing is necessarily other than its own esse, its own existence. But that which is the same as its own esse, God, necessarily cannot be caused. Okay, I found a text too where William gives an argument very similar to Aquinas' third way, which is interesting. Okay, but going on. So here's where Avicenna's 1.7 comes in. So William also follows Avicenna in regarding creatures as possible beings, right? And that's not surprising given how influential Avicenna is for William. Because such beings are in a sense existent neutral, right? They exist, but they don't have to be. William writes that, like through a path, esse possibiliae may lead us to esse necesse per se ipsum. That is because possible being insofar as it is possible is not able to have being or come into being. For the possible from its essence and its intention, ratio, does not have being in actuality, esse in effectum, right? So that's the exact phrase Avicenna just used. For possible being alone is not sufficient for actuality. And then William goes on to say, you know, a being in need necessarily demands a being that's sufficient, right? Ontologically sufficient in itself, not contingent upon anything else to explain its very existence. Rather, such a reality for William will be ipsum suum esse. That's William's language. And it will be nothing but being, ipsum non sit nisi esse, right? So it's very similar to Aquinas' esse tantum of the De Ente, right? But William goes further here. William then takes this phrase esse in effectu, and I think develops it further into this effectus essendi, the act of being. And so he says this in the very next paragraph, right? The possible in comparison to being an act is said to be able to receive the act of being, the effectum essendi. The intention, however, by which it is able to receive being does not bring it about that it ought to have being, but makes it in need of a giver of its being, right? For which reason, the possible does not come nor is educed from potency of being into actuality through its power alone, but is educed through another that adds to it the actuality of being. Therefore, beyond its possibility, it has the actuality of being. However, it does not have this through possibility alone, right? So this is very Avicennian text. But the key thing here is effectum essendi, right? William, however, then later in the De Universo, and it's difficult to date this. Most people say the De Trinitate sometime in the 1220s, and the De Universo maybe in the 1230s, but I think it could be earlier. But he develops this further in De Universo, second part of the first part, 11. So in a passage where the argument is, I think, virtually the same, we see this clear change in terminology on William's part here. So speaking now in a different context, actually against Avicenna, right? So he's arguing here that the universe has a temporal beginning. Against Avicenna, we find this very Avicennian passage. He says, the universe confesses its potentiality and its impossibility of being through itself, for which reason it confesses that its potency or possibility of being belongs to it naturally and from itself, but it has received its actualitatem or actum essendi from elsewhere or from another, right? And this is because possibility or potency, insofar as it is such, does not come into the actum essendi or to exist, but nor does it receive this from another that is similar to itself insofar as it is potential or possible. But it remains in potency or possibility insofar as in itself, for which reason it remains in non-being secundum actum, or in non-being actually. And because therefore potency is natural to it, non-being will also be natural to it, right? So there's this ex nihilo sense in Aquinas where something is ex nihilo in the sense that if left to itself, it would return to nothingness. And that's what William is saying here, right? And we don't have a critical edition of the De Universo, right? And the text is sort of rough in a few places. So I've looked at some of the manuscripts, and from what I've seen, I would say this passage, very reliable from my investigations of some of the manuscripts. So recall our second view here. That the quote, we've seen it already. How am I doing? Yeah, we're doing okay. Recall it was said that Aquinas moved away from Avicenna's essentialism towards a true metaphysics of being, where primacy is assigned to esse as the act of the essence, and an important step in this was the applications of the notions of act and potency to esse and essence, right? So again, I'm bracketing this question of Avicenna, if that's the right interpretation of Avicenna. It's not my interpretation of Avicenna, but it's there and I'm not dealing with it. But what I do want to say here is that William is explicitly referring to existence as the actuality of the essence, the actualitatem of the essence. And he explicitly correlates them as act and potency, right? And this metaphysics is really still quite often taken to be the unique contribution of Aquinas alone, right? You see this all the time, even in very recent literature. But William is clearly doing it, and he's doing it in virtue of reading Avicenna. And so I do want to say here, it's wrong to say, and notice no author's name, right? So the author is still with us, but I disagree with this quite strongly, that it's wrong to say that, quote, Aquinas was the first to take note of the centrality of the actual existence of things as a metaphysically significant feature of them, rather than just a sort of general fact about them. So if you don't want to attribute that to Avicenna, that's fine, right? Nathaniel might disagree with you in a couple minutes. But I want to say, like, William is doing this first, and we have to acknowledge that, right? I also want to say, and William, his metaphysics has received very little attention in English since like 1995. I think you'd be hard pressed to find 40 pages in English since 1995. We could go, back and forth a little bit, but some of the one discussion of William, sort of a very brief discussion. I'm sort of pushing back against here, and I'm going to say, I think it's wrong to say that William merely anticipates Aquinas's understanding of existence as act in virtue of, quote, heavily rhetorical or even poetic analogies of fountains or clouds or the sunlight or something like that. I'm saying, like, no, it's there, right? It's really there. And then just finally, William explicitly says God is pure actus, right? Pure actuality. God is his own being, ipsum suum esse, right? And that should look very Thomistic. So just a couple conclusions. Some conclusions. There's a lot more conclusions in the paper, but suggesting that William is a source for Aquinas is really nothing new, right? If you read Maurer's introduction to his translation of Aquinas as being in essence, he thinks, maybe Aquinas has William on the desk, literally before him or something like that. And maybe that language is too strong, but he certainly sees an influence. Gilson admits it as well. But what I want to suggest is that the full extent and especially the explicit understanding of existence as the act of being hasn't been brought out significantly, right? Secondly, there was a Marquette dissertation in like 1995 on William, but it didn't bring out either of the texts that I pointed to here, De Trinitate 6 or De Universo. And it didn't bring out William's precise dependence on Avicenna with this regard, right? I would also like to suggest that the very commonly repeated disjunction of Aquinas to Avicenna on the nature of esse is like a little bit too simplistic. Aquinas and Avicenna very well could have understood this in very different ways, right? And I'm not dealing with that today. But if William really is a source for what Aquinas is doing, William is without doubt developing based on what he reads in Avicenna. Like that's just clear. And so you still need to see Avicenna, I think, in the background, not just of the essence, existence distinction, but the particular way in which Aquinas understands this distinction, right? Avicenna is still there. Yeah. And also, this reading of Aquinas, this puts Aquinas as a member of a tradition in a context, right? Not the sole shining star in the history of metaphysics or something like that, right? So I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. Okay.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'll bring the microphone around so that our folks on Zoom can hear you guys as well. You can start here.
Thank you. Okay, Seth, so you've put a few nails in this pretty strongly. Let me ask a question that may put the final nail in the coffin on this. What's the understanding of William on the cause of being for the individual thing, such as a dog?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is an interesting question, Thomas. So, what I go to in Thomas, one of my favorite texts in Thomas is Prima Pars 8, Article 1, where Thomas talks about God being intimately in all things as causing the esse of all things. And esse is therefore, Thomas's language here is intimum, right? And I found this in William as well. He refers to existence as the innermost. Intimum is his language as well. And God is sort of intimately present in all things, clothing them in being. And William's language of clothing is interesting. It might sort of suggest Avicenna, but I think it's actually coming from Jeremiah, where God says, I have clothed you with flesh and bone or something like that. So William and Aquinas have this sort of very intimate picture, I think, of God, in the esse of things that I don't see as much in Avicenna. I wouldn't see that at all. Yeah. So I want to say God is causing the esse of everything.
So Aquinas talks about that nothing can cause esse in anything except God and God's immediate presence, even going into it with regard to accidents and substance as well. And so if you have that in William, it's finished. The discussion is finished.
Yeah. And then William has a really nice passage where he says, he's critiquing Aristotle, but he's really critiquing Avicenna. And he just basically says, they haven't understood the intimacy of the creator to all his creatures. Right? Because for Avicenna, God, you can read him at least as saying, well, God's here creating this, and then this creates this, and this creates this. And that's not my reading of Thomas. But there are interesting texts, too, where creatures are causes of esse, in a sense, in Thomas. So that's, yeah.
So let me ask, so I think that matter is pretty well settled. I think you nailed it down. But let me ask again, you referred to Actus Purus once. Is that Actus Purus also in William?
Yeah, explicitly. So, yeah. I know this because, I've seen the Latin, but right. Thomas says Actus Purus, and William says Purus Actus. So, but yeah, it's there. It's there. I think it's in De Trinitate 6 or something like that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Excuse me, sorry.
Thanks. So this was totally great. I just have a suggestion that I think there might be a way for you to make the argument even stronger. So yesterday, Nathaniel and
I'm
I
listening.
So yesterday, Nathaniel and I were talking about this text from the Latin Avicenna that, I mean, correct me, I think it's 1:4, but where Avicenna is talking about what the properties of being that he's going to discuss are, and he says, properties of being include the possible and the necessary, which is to say, the potential and the actual, right? So run that first. So take your first Avicenna text from 1:7 that you put up there, replace necessary with actual and possible with potential, and it looks really close to your the first William text that you put, right? So that could just be William reading the Latin Avicenna, recognizing the equation that the Latin Avicenna makes, and then just producing that text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really good. That text I have in the footnotes, because it's also one of the, I've been criticized before for being like, effectus is an act. Like, it can't mean that. It means effect. And that's wrong from the translation of the Arabic. That's wrong from the context of the Latin Avicenna. William also says that God has esse and effectu per se, right? So I have that as a sort of proof text that I'm not crazy for translating effectus as actus, But yeah, there's other texts where you see this too. So Metaphysics of the Healing 5:1, right? Act is translated as effectus. But the correlation, right, of potency and possibility in that Avicenna text, William's just running with that. They're interchangeable. I'm just, you can read it that way. I know there's people like Dehaan that'll be like, well, no, possibility, that's metaphysics. Potency, that's natural philosophy. That's, that's...
Right, I mean, that's not what Avicenna says in 1:4.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, thanks for that. The text is in the footnotes.
Did you have a question?
Thank you. My question is related, and you elaborated it very well. I'm not a philosopher. I'm in politics, and I'm Iranian by origin, so I feel very strongly toward Avicenna. I want to understand the definition of his concept of belfel, وجود belfel. Belfel, the existence, the potentiality. From our understanding in our language of belfel, it implies a latency of potentiality, meaning that it already exists. The latency pre-exists the potentiality that needs to be then guided. And this is a layperson's interpretation of the word. I'm wondering if you can please shed some light about your understanding of this word. Thank you.
Yeah, I should really punt to Nathaniel on this one. This is one of the issues, I think, where Thomas can be so hesitant about Avicenna. So there was an article by Beatrice Zedler and some other ones that, in a sense, Avicenna is dealing with this notion of what belongs to something per se versus what belongs to it from another. And so there's this idea that if the essence of something belongs to it per se, then maybe, and this is some of the criticisms that come out of these articles, then maybe that's not created. And there's sort of these quasi-ghostly essences floating around before creation. That's not my reading of Avicenna. William's clearly not doing that, right? And then I've got a lot of texts where Thomas actually accepts this language too of what sort of belongs to something per se and from another. So, yeah, I think that's an interesting topic in Avicenna. It makes lots of Thomas hesitant about Avicenna. It's not necessarily my reading of Avicenna. I think Avicenna does have this sort of robust sense of creation ex nihilo. I mean, he says as much. But then that becomes an interesting issue of, okay, now where are these essences? He refers to these as divine quiddities, divine essence, something like that, in Metaphysics of the Healing 5. And so does that somehow have an issue with the simplicity of the necessary being? And that's a whole another issue. Yeah. Vilkua, I haven't done, yeah, in potentia. Yeah, So they'll follow like being an act, doing, right? So that's one of the reasons why I think effectus is clearly meaning act, right? It's just look at the Arabic. The Arabic means there. My Arabic's not great though. Should be better. Don't tell my dissertation director.
Okay, I think that brings us to time for Seth's talk. So thank you. All right, our next speaker this morning is Dr. Nathaniel Taylor. He is an assistant professor in the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. His research concerns medieval Arabic and Latin metaphysics, logic, and philosophy of language, especially in the works of Avicenna and Thomas Aquinas. His paper is titled Explaining What Form and Matter Cannot, Aquinas' Avicennian Way to the Essence-Esse Distinction.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I'm delighted to be here and to join you. There's a handout coming around. My apologies. I'm in the kind of Greg Doolan school of absurdly long handouts. Although, in order to appropriately differentiate myself, mine are ugly, whereas his are quite good looking. So my apology. Yeah, my apologies for the length of it. The paper I want to give today, my topic is on the genus argument. And so we're not actually going to talk about what the genus argument is, how it works, until later in the paper. So I just thought I would give it to you right there at the top in case you need a reminder what the genus argument is about.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Unplug it. I don't know.
Is that better? Okay. So the issue I want to deal with today, this is an issue that's been discussed in the literature. I'm following up my mentor and teacher, Dave Twetton, an issue that he brought up in a Dewan Festschrift. So he brings up this issue that perhaps all of the arguments for the essence existence, the essence being distinction, beg the question. This particular objection has been thrown against the genus argument in particular with with great regularity over time. So I have on your handout here on the first page and throughout the second and third page as well a little bit some kind of common representatives of this worry about the genus argument that I'm going to change David's terminology a little bit. I want to call it the bait and switch suspicion. And it sort of goes something like this. The genus argument purports to prove a distinction between essence and being, or essence and existence. But you see Joseph de Finance very early on. We could ask whether this text envisions a distinction between nature and supposit. And Leo Sweeney follows along the very same lines. Couldn't it be form and matter, or at least nature as universal and then instantiated universal? John Whipple, really, of blessed memory, really puts this nicely. At first, it appears in the argument, esse may signify nothing more than a particular, actually existing member of a generic or specific class, that is, a particular concrete existent. One cannot yet assume what remains to be proved, namely that esse already signifies an act principle, which is really distinct from the essence principle of each particular substance. And so David picks up this issue from Monsignor Whipple. And he writes, imagine the reaction of the Aristotelian, who can agree with Aquinas that form and matter are really distinct principles within extramental reality. But Aristotle, as nearly everyone today agrees, never theorized about to enai as really distinct from matter and form. The Aristotelian can concede that the reasoning from premise to premise in the various arguments for a real distinction is valid. Nevertheless, the conclusion depends on one's already having granted, in addition to the familiar substance-level constituents of an Aristotelian ontology, matter and form, a third constituent of one's ontology, esse, the actuality of essence. And then David particularly goes after the genus argument on this point. The genus argument proves only that there must be some really distinct principle to distinguish two things that actually are and that belong to the same genus. Does not individuating matter alone suffice? Whatever is the source of individuality is also the source of pluralization within a class. And the Aristotelian can say that this is matter, not Thomas Esse. To assume that it is esse is to beg the question. And so all of these texts kind of focus around this worry. Is the genus argument purporting to prove a distinction between essence and being, but really just proving a form-matter distinction? And so I call this the bait-and-switch suspicion. And I want to argue today that David in his article said there's no explicit text where Aquinas addresses this issue, and so we can only theorize and make arguments for our own, from our own creativity. I actually think that Aquinas has given us a very clear answer to this. He certainly does not address the question precisely as formulated, but there are very clear answers about the limits of the form-matter distinction, and when we read the text articulating what that limit is, we find, I argue, in a distinctively Avicennian route to the distinction between being and essence. So with that kind of established, I invite you to look at text 1 on your handout. Now, unfortunately, because of time, I won't get a chance to read all these out loud to you, but I've bolded the important parts, so if you can skim quickly, it's there for you. Now, this first text from the Danishnama, Avicenna is addressing the question of whether God is in the category of substance, and he gives the definition of substance. And notice right away, he's very attentive to a problem. In the definition of substance, the word being is found because being not in a subject is a constitutive element, a constitutive feature of substance. So if not being in a subject is an essential and necessary element of substance, what do we mean by being, such that being could be said to be an essential and constitutive feature of a substance's essence? Here, Avicenna is quick to explain that to say that being falls into the definition of substance does not entail that it has realized existence. In other texts, Avicenna will say that being not in a subject does not entail that being an act, wujud bilfil, is in the definition of substance. The reason for this is that substances are of the condition that one does not know whether they have realized existence or being an act until its being is found in a subject. Here, I think Avicenna intends that to know that some X actually exists is to be acquainted with the essence of X instantiated in a particular subject. If you're curious more about that, please see my published work. Thus, to know whether a human exists is to know a particular subject. Zayed, he always gives the example of, who is a human. But this is different from knowing that some X is a substance, because to know that some X is a substance is to know simply the condition of its existence, that when or if it exists not in a subject, but as a subject. Therefore, the being not in a subject that is said of substances as a constitutive element and a part of its definition cannot mean actually existing here and now, not in a subject. This conclusion entails another important conclusion. Actually existing here and now, not in a subject, is not said univocally and generically of substances, but being not in a subject as a constitutive element of substance is said univocally and generically of substance. This is why the necessary being is not in the genus of substance. The being not in a subject that is said generically and univocally of creatures cannot be said of the necessary being univocally and generically, but only analogically. But being not in a subject is not said analogically of those things in the genus of substance, but univocally. Because not being in a subject is a necessary and constitutive fact about the essence of substances, like humans. Not being in a subject can be predicated of human, like a genus, univocally, generically. This is what it means to treat substance as a genus, as a class under which many species fall by virtue of some shared feature. Because the being not in a subject, which is predicated of a substance as a genus, does not include actually existing here and now, not in a subject. It follows that actual existence is not predicated of a substance like a genus. Now, I want to get to Aquinas in this talk, and this text from the Danishnama, Aquinas would not have known directly, but he would have known it by Al-Ghazali's quasi-interpretation translation of the Danishnama, and that is there in text 2 for you. Now we find in text 2 very much the same message as we saw in Avicenna. To be a substance is to be a being, not in a subject. But by being not in a subject, we do not mean being an act, esse in effectu, or actually existing here and now. For there's a difference between knowing the condition of a substance's existence and knowing its actual existence. From this, it's clear that the being that falls in the definition of substance is not being an act. Although Al-Ghazali does not make the same point about predicating being not in a subject generically and univocally as Avicenna does in text 2, Aquinas still would have been familiar with this point in a passage in Avicenna's Metaphysics of the Healing, addressing, again, the same issue. Is God in the genus of substance? And so this is text 3 in your handout. Here, Avicenna states explicitly that in order for some predicate to be predicated like a genus, that is, univocally of its subject, the predicate term must not only name the subject, but also have its definition be truly applied to the subject. But while you can doubt whether Socrates is an actually existing subject, you cannot doubt that Socrates is the sort of thing whose existence is not in a subject, but who exists as a subject. That description, the description actually existing, that might not be true of Socrates, but the description, the sort of thing whose existence is not in a subject, that is necessarily and essentially true of Socrates. So, in sum, we have from these texts what I want to call the Avicennian route to the real distinction between being and essence. The route comprises, this is AR1 on your handout, the occasion on which this distinction is discovered. AR2 on your handout, the background you need in order to, AR3, make the argument that leads you to AR4, the conclusion, the being-essence distinction in the categories. The Avicennian route to a real distinction between being and essence goes something like this. When faced with the question of how to define the categories of being, the most obvious starting place is to distinguish the category of substance from the categories of accidents by virtue of the fact that substances do not need a subject in order to be. Indeed, they are subjects. Whereas accidents do need a subject in which to inhere. It's requisite that one understands these conditions of being as essential to substances and accidents. How a thing has its being is the determining feature of substances and accidents, and thus how a thing has its being falls into its definition. Now, if being not in a subject falls into a thing's definition as a constitutive element of a thing's essence, then you have to clarify that being cannot signify being an act or actual existence. Otherwise, just as one would know that some substance X is necessarily not in a subject, one would know that some substance X necessarily exists now, not in a subject. The difference between these two indicates that being an act or actual existence cannot be a constitutive element of a thing's essence, and thus that there's a real distinction between being, in the sense of being an act or realized being, and essence. I'm not going to defend the soundness of this argument here. I just wanted to get through kind of how is Avicenna thinking about this. All right, on to Aquinas. So let's return to this question that we started with. Are these arguments just proving a form-matter distinction? Why do you need an essence-being distinction if form and matter are kind of seem to be able to do all the work? Now, though Aquinas never raises these questions in this precise formulation, I think it's clear that he has an answer to them. Aquinas tells us the limit of the form-matter distinction, and as I shall argue, we find there, at the limit, the occasion for discovering the essence-being distinction along this Avicennian route. So recall that the first step in the Avicennian route, the occasion for discovering the being-essence distinction, is the task of defining the categories. Now, Aquinas often takes up this task in texts concerning whether God is in the category of substance, indeed, like Avicenna. Now, so before we discuss these texts getting into whether God is in the genus of substance, I want to start with a different text. Let's start with a text on defining the categories. Now, the text I want to look at comes from Aquinas' early De Ente et Essentia. And in this text, Aquinas explains how the notions of genus, difference, and species relate to accidents differently than how they relate to substance. For in a composite substance, the form and matter join together to produce something of a complete nature, and this composite is in the category of substance. Thus, the genus of a substance, in its definition, is taken up from the matter, and the difference is taken up from the form. And the definition of the substance is the combination of that genus and that difference. But as Aquinas explains, the genus and difference of an accident cannot be reached in this way. This is text 4 in your handout. Whereas composite substances are defined by the combination of their genus and difference taken up from their form and matter, accidents which are not composed of form and matter must be defined differently. This is why Aquinas goes on to explain from where we have to derive the accident's genus. Aquinas claims that since accidents do not have matter, their genus must be taken up from their mode of being. Clearly, we've discovered a limitation of the form-matter distinction. The form-matter distinction cannot be used to define the categories of accidents. In order to correctly understand and define the accidents, and that entails understanding how they differ from the category of substance, we have no recourse to the form-matter distinction because accidents just don't have matter. So, on what occasion must we go beyond the form-matter distinction? On the occasion of defining the categories. But you'll remember, the occasion of defining the categories is step 1 in the Avicennian route to the essence being distinction. Now, that we have to define the categories with recourse to their modes of being is a common doctrine in Aquinas. Across his corpus, Aquinas argues that the categories cannot be understood as species of being, such that being is their genus and they're distinguished according to some formal determination like a difference. And this is, you see this in text 5. This is the De Veritate. Here we find the same doctrine we saw in the De Ente et Essentia, except it concerns substance now. Being, which is not a genus and cannot be diversified according to some formal determination like a difference, is divided according as some mode is added to being. Here Aquinas clarifies what he means by mode of being. The mode of being for a substance is being per se. What does that mean? Well, Aquinas, in a text in the Sentences commentary, clarifies that esse, to be, is something common and is not determined to some mode of being, but to subsist signifies a determinate mode of being, namely, according as something is a being through itself, per se, as opposed to accidents, which are in another. In explaining how the act of being and the act of subsisting differ, Aquinas says that whereas to be conveys something common and indeterminate, to subsist conveys a determinate mode of being, being not in another. The implication here, of course, is that which is through itself, not in another, is substance, and the mode of being that belongs to accidents is being in another. And later in the De Veritate, Aquinas tells us that these modes of being are based in the very essence of the thing. So being through itself or not in another is said essentially and necessarily of substance. Being in another is said essentially and necessarily of accident. Now, let's pause here to recall the background to the Avicennian route to the essence being distinction. The background concerns the categories as a division of being divided according as essences have different modes of existence, different ways of existing when or if they exist. To substance belongs the condition of being not in a subject, and to accidents belong the condition of being in a subject. These conditions belong essentially and necessarily to substance and accident, such that they're inseparable. Substances cannot be in subjects, and accidents cannot be without subjects. Let's not talk about the Eucharist right now. Okay. The necessary background to the Avicennian route is there in Aquinas. So we've got the occasion, we've got the background. Let's get into the arguments with this last bit of our time. I want to present one version of the genus argument that I think is most clearly Avicennian, and then I want to present you another version of the genus argument that is most susceptible to this kind of bait and switch worry that I think when we correctly understand the Avicennian background, we kind of have a different reading on it. So, take a look at text 7 in your handout. In this text, we find some familiar claims. On the occasion of contemplating the definition of substance and accident, in essence being distinction is discovered on account of the fact that being cannot be common like a genus. For whatever the definition of substance and accident will be, it must be predicated of a substance like a genus, essentially. But to exist through itself cannot be common like a genus, and therefore cannot be predicated like a genus. Why? Well, I think Avicenna has Aquinas has Avicenna in mind. Recall text 3 above and step 3.2 from above. To be predicated like a genus requires that the predicate term be both a name for the subject term and the definition of the predicate term be truly said of the subject term. Of course, a substance is not existence through itself. Rather, a substance is a thing to which belongs existence through itself. That description can be truly predicated of a substance. Therefore, the being that shows up in the definition of substance and accident cannot signify being an act or actual here and now existence. To exist not in a subject does appear in the definition of substance, but there it does not signify actual here and now existence, but rather it signifies the way or manner according to which substances acquire or are owed being. Now take a text like this in text 7 and compare it to a text like text 8. In this early formulation of the genus argument from the sentences, Aquinas highlights that being an act is not owed to humanity by virtue of its being humanity. In other more Avicennian words, being an act is not a constitutive element of that by which a human is a human. Aquinas' proof that being an act is not contained in humanity is that we can be ignorant of a human's actual here and now existence while knowing its essence. And we also find a familiar statement about predicating a genus. The genus and species qua predicables are universals, and thus, by definition, are predicable of many things. Now, Aquinas says that being an act cannot be predicated of many things because being an act pertains to particular supposits. It's proper to them, qua individuals, in a way that genus and species are not. Now, I think that those who have the bait and switch suspicion want to read text 9 like this. This is not my view. This is how they would read it. They want to say something like this. Aquinas is arguing here that being an act must be distinct from essence because being an act occurs to an essence only when it's received in this or that. That is, only when it's instantiated in a particular supposit. But if being an act is a result of instantiation, then the distinction that's really doing the work in this text is not an essence being distinction, but rather an essence instantiation distinction. And an essence instantiation distinction does not require any real distinction between essence and another metaphysical principle, being an act. Really, all you need is a principle that explains commonality, form, and a principle that explains individuality. So I've been baited and switched. But keep in mind, and here's how I think we should read text 9, that being an act occurs to an essence when that essence is received in an individual supposit does not explain why there's a real distinction between being an act and essence. Rather, that being an act occurs to an essence when that essence is received in an individual supposit explains why being an act is not predicated commonly, that is, like a genus. Pay close attention to how Aquinas orders this argument. Everything that is in a genus has an essence different from being. Why? Because the thing's being is not contained in its essence such that to think of the one is to think of the other. Why? Because the essence is common, predicable generically and univocally, but being an act is not common. If the being and act were identical with the essence, then being an act would be common to everything sharing in that essence, but being an act is not common, therefore being an act is not identical with essence. Read this way, the Avicennian heritage of the argument is clear. That's about the end of my time. Everyone, thank you very much. Quite all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathaniel. We have 5 or 6 minutes for questions. So. Oh, quite okay.
through a quick tour through a lot of the text.
Oh, that was marvelous and requires a lot more thinking than I can do at this particular moment. But I wanted to call attention to a couple of things. I'd also maybe pull in Seth just a little bit too. And that is, so I'm looking at your handout, I guess this is page 3, at T1 Avicenna Danishname.
Yes.
I wanted to call your attention to that notion about halfway down, being inia is not found in the subject.
Yes.
I think inia has been a problem in
Yes.
translation because it's also structurally similar to ania. Ania is clearly existence. I mean, it's only Hamza at the top or Hamza at the bottom, that sort of thing. And in many manuscripts, there's no Hamza, so you don't know what it's going to be.
Yeah.
But I think the proper understanding of this, which befits what you have here, is inia is this particular
Yeah.
being. This, and so it's more associated with wujud al-khas, to some extent, the esse proprium in some sense, but more properly, it's the totatia, the hoc aliquid. So in your context here, with this text from Avicenna, it would be the Essence-Esse condition until it's instantiated in being, until it's instantiated in particular being found not in a subject. See, so that's
Yeah,
a sense of it. I want to
That's right.
call your attention to that. And if you read this consistently through Avicenna, I think it works all the way through.
Very good.
But this is Marmora uses that existence.
Yes.
And this afternoon, I'll modify that and say individual existence.
Yes.
The other thing I want to call attention to is your use of Al-Ghazali. And there he is, on the next page.
Yes. Text 2.
Yes, text T2, yes. And the essay in effectu, which I want to be sure that Seth saw that, because surely William of Auvergne saw this.
Yes.
So that's all I have to
Yes.
share on that.
Just real quickly, William's reading Al-Ghazali. I think that's coming in. He's reading it more in De Universo later.
Yeah.
I think the De Trinitate is more Avicenna.
Yes. So, in effectu, this is a common term in the Latin, in the Latin manuscripts of these Arabic authors, but it's not commonly known that this was Gunnissalinus's phrase for being an act. So we can trace. I think Van Rey traces it to Gunnissalinus. That's right. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Nat. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
It's fascinating. And what you say at the end about the argument, it makes a lot of sense that he's not trying to show the need for an individuating principle, but the non-commonality of essay. But my question, maybe I just didn't follow, because it is a lot.
Yeah.
The text that you gave us from Avicenna, to me, they sound more like the intellectus essentiae argument
Yes.
than the genus. Can you talk? You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Can you spell that out a little bit? How you're connecting it with the genus?
I would love to. So this is a fascinating point about Aquinas', especially his early forms of the genus argument, like the text 9 from the sentences. You see that Aquinas is not yet thinking of the intellectus essentiae argument and the genus argument as distinct arguments. You see the intellectus essentiae argument is kind of a part of the genus argument. The big question is, what explains that? Why is he doing it that way? And my argument is because that's how Avicenna is doing it, and that's how Al-Ghazali is presenting it. So, in these early texts, Aquinas kind of uses the intellectus essentiae argument as a step in the genus argument. And frankly, I think it's still kind of there even in the later versions of the genus argument. I'm not eager to separate them too strongly. Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right, I think we have time for one more quick question. Excuse me, ma'am, sorry.
Thanks, Nathaniel. So anytime we give a real definition of something, we can give a real definition through any of the relevant causes.
Yes.
And at least two relevant causes, right, the final cause and the efficient cause, are extrinsic causes,
Yes.
right? So it is possible to give the real definition of something in terms of something that is extrinsic to the thing.
Yes.
right? So suppose hypothetically esse, right, being like in itself or being in another was conceived of as like a final cause of being. Then you could have a definition of substance as that which exists in another, right? That the nature of which is to exist in another, and then that doesn't require you to like the inclusion of esse in the definition doesn't actually require esse in act to be intrinsic to the thing, and you never mentioned this, but it like the whole talk, it seemed like it's going in parallel. Is that just a completely separate conversation, or is there actually a connection here?
Can you clarify just at the end there, parallel connection?
So the way that you were always talking about it sounded to me like your reading of Avicenna and Aquinas goes something like this. Look, we've got this problem. If you put esse in the definition of the thing, then then everything's got to have like the same esse in act, right? Like, so we can't have esse as intrinsic. So what we're going to do is we're going to say there's a different sense of being going on, right? There's like the end sense, and then there's the esse in act sense, and all we're doing when we posit being in the definition is just the first sense, not the second sense. Yeah. But it seems like another way you could do it that maybe is friendly is to say, no, look, you can posit esse in the definition of something without positing it as an intrinsic formal cause.
Yeah, I see. So the reason I'm preferring the more internal intrinsic cause reading is I think that, so Avicenna's language, I keep using this term constitutive feature, right. Constitutive element is mukawim. And this sometimes translated as kind of the subsistence, but that's not quite right. This is a term that in Avicenna's work is reserved for internal causes. It's often used of the differentia. And so here's where I think there's kind of this interesting play. Of course, we're giving a definition of the categories which can't properly be defined. We're giving something like a quasi-differentia. And so because of Avicenna's language, it's suggestive of an internal cause. That's why I'm led in the direction. But is Aquinas, of course, is Aquinas kind of picking up on the subtleties of the language? I want to suggest he is, but you raise a strong objection. Maybe that subtlety just goes right over Aquinas. But yeah, no, thank you very much. I'll have to think a bit more about that.
All right, that brings us to time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, our final speaker this morning is Dr. Traci Phillipson. She is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa, where she teaches primarily in the history of philosophy and the philosophy of human nature. She specializes in medieval philosophy with a focus on the philosophical psychology and anthropology of Averroes and its influence on Aquinas. Her paper is titled Aquinas' Philosophical and Moral Psychology in Light of Averroes. Let's welcome our speaker.
Thank you. So, given that this is an Aquinas conference, I have done things a little bit differently than I normally do. I am normally a bit more interested in Averroes as a kind of underlying source. Here I'm starting and primarily talking about Aquinas, and my concern is what Aquinas thinks his understanding of the intellect and the will solves in his understanding of Averroes. I should point out that I don't think his understanding of Averroes is always correct. Especially, I think he is just incorrect about the nature and location of the will in Averroes. But I'm sort of tabling what is normally my biggest concern for the sake of seeing what Aquinas thinks he's doing, what Aquinas thinks the problems in Averroes are and how he's getting them right. To start us off, I am going to read a fairly extensive passage from Aquinas' De Unitate Intellectus. I take it to be sort of an exemplary passage of Aquinas bringing together his understandings of the intellect and the will to make a claim about the impossibility of moral responsibility in Averroes. So Aquinas says, furthermore, according to their position, the position of the Averroists, the principles of moral philosophy would be destroyed. For what is in us would be taken away. For something is not in us except through our will, and this indeed is called voluntary because it is in us. But the will is in the intellect, as is clear from the statement of Aristotle in Book 3 of the De Anima. From the fact that there is intellect and will in separate substances, and also from the fact that it happens through the will that we love or hate something in general, just as we hate robbers as a class, as Aristotle says in his Rhetoric. If, therefore, the intellect does not belong to this man in such a way that it is truly one with him, but is united to him only through phantasms or as a mover, the will not be in this man, but in a separate intellect. And so this man will not be the master of his act, nor will any act of his be praiseworthy or blameworthy. This is to destroy the principle of moral philosophy. Since this is absurd and is contrary to human life, for it would not be necessary to take counsel or make law, it follows that the intellect is united to us in such a way that it and we constitute what is truly one being. This surely can be only in the way in which it has been explained, that is, that the intellect is a power of the soul which is united to us as form. It remains, therefore, that this must be held without any doubt, not on account of the revelation of faith, as they say, but because to deny this is to strive against what is clearly apparent. So the idea here in this text of Aquinas, I think we see a couple of important things. He is concerned that in order to maintain moral responsibility, all principles of morality, we have to require that the intellects and the will are in the human being. Aquinas thinks that Averroes holds that the will is in the intellects, and so he doesn't have to say too much about the will as such here. If it's in the intellects and the intellects are separate, he thinks there's a clear problem with respect to moral responsibility. More interesting for me is the reason that the intellects have to be separate as well. Even if we can grant, like I think we should, that he just has an incorrect understanding of Averroes, is there anything with respect to the will? Is there anything that is still necessary about having internal and individuated intellects? What's going on there? So that's going to be the focus here, primarily Aquinas' argument for individuating intellects according to the number of persons, and what he thinks that's solving in Averroes' in his understanding of Averroes' position. So we should say something about the arguments that Aquinas gives here with respect to the intellects. Aquinas discusses both the possible and agent intellects, of course, arguing for their existence as powers of the soul, which are multiplied according to the number of individuals. The argument that the possible intellect is so individuated is not unique. Averroes is sort of the outlier there, holding that it's separate. But most folks, until Aquinas, thought that the agent intellect or actual intellect was a separate substance, so that is a somewhat unique position for Aquinas. He says, so the idea is that the fact that a person can be at one time actually understanding, but at another time only in potentiality with respect to understanding, demonstrates that there must exist a potential intellect, the possible intellect, which is, quote, impotency to and able to receive all those things which are intelligible to a human being, end quote. This intellect does not have a bodily organ, since it would then be limited in its scope of understanding by the organ's powers. But neither is it a separate substance, totally disconnected from the body. The possible intellect is a part or power of the human soul, which is the form of the body, according to Aquinas. If it were a separate substance, he explains, it would not be possible to say that the individual human being understands by means of the possible intellect. A substance's operation must originate in that substance. The act of understanding attributed to the human being must originate in that human being. Additionally, Since this act of understanding is an act of the possible intellect must be in each individual as her own intellect. That is to say, the possible intellect must be multiplied according to the number of human beings. Aquinas explains this in the Summa, question 76, where he says, in order to maintain he claims in order to maintain the individuality of human beings as knowers, and as distinct human beings, insofar as to be human is to be a knower, we must maintain that each person has his or her own intellect. It's impossible to explain, according to Aquinas, the diversity in understanding and knowledge using any other means. In Aquinas' view, even if we recognize that individuals have their own sensory experiences and their own phantasms, this is not enough on its own to explain individual knowledge. I should maybe stop here and say he takes that to kind of be Averroes' position. Averroes holds that the possible intellect is, or as he calls it, the material intellect is separate, a separate entity used by all human beings, but he claims that it is nonetheless formed for us, subject to our will, used by each individual such that while it's being used, it is each individual person's material intellect. Aquinas clearly thinks that's not enough. We can't just connect ourselves via experience and phantasms, which is what he thinks Averroes is doing, in a strong enough way to allow the intellect, the possible intellect, to still be ours, to still make us knowers. So I'll continue here. So it's the intelligible species in the possible intellect and not the phantasms, according to Aquinas, which account for knowledge. A single human being can have many phantasms of the same type of thing, but these only create a single intelligible species, and this leads to a single act of understanding the nature of the thing. Aquinas points out, contrary to the view of Averroes, he thinks, that multiplying the number of intellects does not affect the universality. Aquinas points out, contrary to the view of Averroes, that multiplying the number of intellects does not affect the universality of the resulting knowledge. Since we understand the natures of things and not separate intelligibles, having multiple intelligible species in multiple intellects can result in multiple understandings of the universal common natures. He makes a similar argument in the Summa Constantiales, stating, quote, it has been proved that the substance of the intellect is united to the human body as its form, but one form cannot possibly exist in more than one matter. Therefore, there is not one intellect for all men. End quote. It makes no sense, according to Aquinas, to assert that the form is simultaneously the form of the individual human being, the source of their humanity, as distinct from their animality and their knowledge, and that it is distinct from the individual and shared by all humans. In his view, a substantial form must be exclusive to that of which it is the form. Otherwise, all the individuals with the same form would have the same being, and that is clearly not the case. Having determined that the possible intellect must exist and must be individuated, Aquinas moves on to talk about the agent intellect. Might skip a bit of this for the sake of time. He tries to demonstrate that the agent intellect must also be individuated according to the number of persons, despite its being separable, unaffectable, unmixed, end quote, in actuality as regards to its substance, end quote. He explains that there must exist a power which makes potentially intelligible things actually intelligible and presents them to the possible intellect. If this weren't the case, there would be no way for the intelligible objects known by the possible intellect to come into being. The power responsible for producing these intelligibles is the agent intellect. The agent intellect has to be multiplied according to the number of individuals, just like the possible intellect for Aquinas, so that the process of actually thinking is in each person. I will skip some of my commentary to just provide one additional quote here. Aquinas says, there must be in us an essential active principle of our own through which we are made to be actually understanding. And this principle is the agent intellect. And a bit later, taking place within, So the act of understanding then has to be taking place within the person. So that's the idea. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip a little bit more and just talk about what is this doing for Aquinas, does he think, with respect to his understanding of Averroes. Aquinas recognizes, of course, that Averroes has separate material and agent intellects. He does not think that it's enough for Averroes to hold that the intellects are formed for us, that they're subject to our will. He is very concerned about the what's usually called the dual subject theory, and the ways in which he thinks this theory does not fully explain each individual person's being a knower. So his account, Aquinas' account, he thinks has established issues in a way which solve a number of problems, which he sees in Averroes. So those problems, for example, in the sentences, Aquinas explains Averroes as holding the following position, quote, "The agent intellect as well as the possible intellect is eternal and is one in all human beings, but the intelligible species are not eternal. He also holds that the agent intellect is not related to the possible intellect as its form, but as a craftsman to matter, and that the understood species abstracted from phantasms are as form of the possible intellect, and that from the two of these there comes to be the intellect in a positive disposition," end quote. He notes that this position is supposed to show that the intellects can be eternal while still allowing for human participation in the creation of intelligible species. That is, the intelligible is an act. However, he sees a number of problems with this. For example, Aquinas claims that Averroes' view does not allow for an individual human being to understand through its own conjunction with the possible intellect. Averroes' view is that each individual has her own phantasms by which she conjoins to the possible intellect via the intelligible species, which has the phantasm and the possible intellect as its subject. So this is the dual subject theory. This view, according to Aquinas, leads to the conclusion that there is a part of the human being which is eternal, the possible intellect, but that the rest of the human being is not eternal. Thus, there's no immortality of the soul for Averroes in Aquinas' reading. And of course, he rejects this. He claims that that Averroes' view does not allow for a proper conjoining of possible intellect and individual human being. Additionally, he explains that under Averroes' view, the human being would not be a human being in a determinate species insofar as a human being has intellect. That is, since the entire locus of intellectual operations would be outside the individual human being, it would not be proper to call the individual a rational being. This is because the connection between the individual and the intellect is accidental rather than substantial in Aquinas' understanding of Averroes. The intellects in Averroes' view, according to Aquinas, are not intrinsically or substantially connected to the individual human being. Instead, they have an accidental connection at the time thought is occurring, as they use the images presented by the individual's cogitative power in the process of abstraction. What's more, this is Aquinas claims this is contrary to Aristotle's view, quote, that the soul is united to the body without anything intermediate and also without any mediating knowledge, end quote. Aquinas points out that Averroes' view would result not in particular human being understanding, but rather in her being understood. And he says this is the case since the possible intellect would be understanding the phantasms which the individual human being imagines. This results from the fact that, according to Aquinas, the intellects are not intrinsic to the human being. As I said, I don't think that Aquinas is quite right. certainly he's wrong about his understanding of the will. And so I think there would be more to say, even if we grant that there might be some suspicions about the dual subject theory, that he should not take so lightly Averroes' claim that the intellects are formed for us subject to our will. It could perhaps be the will, I haven't developed this too far, that makes that connection strong enough that they can be truly intrinsic to us. Certainly that's what Averroes thinks. The will and the cogitative power functioning to bring the intellects into us as our form in a way which avoids a lot of the issues that Aquinas points out. I am still undecided about whether I think Aquinas is right about the problems with the dual subject theory. Lots of folks have written about how we ought to best understand what Averroes is doing here. I am sympathetic to Aquinas' concerns about moral responsibility, given that moral responsibility requires not only the kind of particular knowledge we can easily explain with a will, which is individuated, and the cogitative power is a kind of reason, but also given the need to understand the good on a more abstract, fundamental level, which perhaps Aquinas is onto something when he says that means that the intellects, which house and work on that understanding, ought to be individuated. But more work to do there for me, and I'm out of time, so I will leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Phillipson. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So.
Thanks, Traci. You ran through some of the you were summarizing some of the arguments from Aquinas there at the end of the paper, but you didn't mention the one about the definition of human beings as being within their their proper species. And I once heard a great Dominican say that you could define things with any of the four causes, including extrinsic causes like the efficient and the final cause. So I was wondering if that sort of argument could be used against Aquinas's objection there, that in fact you can define some things, at least at sometimes, through extrinsic things.
And so we wouldn't have to have the concern that Aquinas has that, if the intellects are extrinsic to us, we lose our definition as knower, as rational being.
Yeah, as long as you think of them, the separate intellects as, in some ways, our most important efficient causes. They're the things that bring us into knowing or an approximation of knowing. And they're certainly our final causes for Averroes in some way.
Interesting. I think that would be worth exploring. I think I have this persistent concern about, especially with respect to moral responsibility, locating the understanding of the good in something extrinsic, even if I can make use of it by my will whenever I want, really easily, in the way that Averroes thinks you can through repeated use. Once I've figured out what a pen is, I can connect back really easily to the possible and ancient intellects. I have the phantasm that helps, the cogitative power helps me make that connection. And of course he means it to be intrinsic while you're using them, but I'm still suspicious. But perhaps that sort of research, or that sort of line of thinking could be a useful resource, yeah.
I just would like to make a quick reply to that suggestion, because I don't think that really works, because even though you can in a sense define something by an external cause, in the sense of like you're truly identifying it, that's not the same thing as saying you can say that the thing is the external cause. And I think it seems to me that Aquinas' argument here is saying you are not a thing that knows if your intellect is not a part of you. In the same way, like you can define a house as something built by a house builder, but you can't say that therefore a house is something which builds, which does the activity of a house builder, but rather it's just connected as its effect. And I think the problem here, or the argument you're presenting, is that Aquinas is saying, well, this needs to be formally, like a kind of formal cause of a person for it to work.
But I do think that Averroes intends for it to be something close to, like, he's pretty clear that when we are using the intellect, they are, he says, in us as our form. So they are both separate, eternally existing entities, and also in us as our form when we're using.
So just to follow up on Traci's response there, right? So here's one thing that Aquinas certainly acknowledges that that might be a really interesting way to think of, is I have no idea. I defer to you guys. Is this the way that Averroes is sort of conceptualizing the relationship between the human being and the separate intellect? Consider any power, right? A power is defined through its act, but the act is extrinsic to the power, right? And when the power is in act, there's some sense in which the actuality of the power is now in the power, right? It's not in the power in the sense of being intrinsic to the definition of the power as actual, right? But it is, the power is just defined by its telos, right? And sometimes the telos is actualized, and sometimes the telos is not, right? And the power is always the power, whether the telos is achieved or not, right? And so is the human being kind of, is Averroes thinking of the human being as like that which is sort of like in potency, teleologically ordered to connection with the separate intellect, and like sometimes the connection is there, sometimes it's not, and when it's there, we're kind of like a power actualized. I mean, question mark.
I think that would be a problem for Averroes, in that then you're making the human being, I mean, the analogy would be right that the human being is the act of the power, which is the intellect. And that seems to be greatly reducing the importance and the being of the human being, if we're reducing it to something that's analogous to an act of a power. So the power would be the the substantially existing thing, I suppose, in that sense. Human beings aren't just, they're substances, right, in the most proper sense. They rely on the intellects for their defining feature, and those intellects belong to the human beings. But it strikes me, I'll have to think more about it. It strikes me that could, cheapen the human being in a way that Averroes would not want. And I don't think it's necessitated by his view, but
It was just supposed to be an analogy.
yeah, it's an interesting analogy,
Or there's another response.
though.
Yes. But there are problems in this, quite a number. I want to bounce around a little bit and then go back to contextualize what's going on. One is that in book 4, I forgot, distinction 48, I think. At any rate, in the commentary on the sentences, Thomas does talk about an external power enhancing the ability of the human soul to have knowledge at a level that it does not naturally have, to raise it so that it can see God or to know God's essence in some limited way, not comprehensively. And so, so he does accede to something he rejected with regard to natural epistemology. He accedes to it for supernatural epistemology, and that's a controversial issue. Just exactly what that means, because following the analogy of what you're saying, then when God raises us up in the next life so that we can see God, isn't it really God seeing God? Because it's if the power the power is responsible for doing that. God gives us the power to do that. But anyway, this was raised as a problem by some later people. I think they misunderstood it, but it was raised as a problem. I guess I want to revert to one of my favorite principles, which is to contextualize things, to understand what's really going on, and look at the sources as well. Aquinas, anyone doesn't know, Traci didn't bother to mention it, but Aquinas was so delighted when the translation of Themistius' paraphrase, the De Anima, came through, and he said, Themistius, this is exactly what I've been saying all along, and about the nature of the soul. Themistius has it exactly right. And of course, that's just not true. But he had Themistius earlier only via Averroes, and Averroes had his own spin on it, which in some sense was much more accurate than Aquinas'. But he was really enthusiastic because suddenly he had someone who had, like Aquinas, the right understanding of Aristotle's De Anima 3:5. Well, in the context, though, the first one to propose that the power of this active power for abstraction, etc., is Phillipson, and as an individual soul. The other is Themistius, ali quo modo, and after that, Bernardo Carlos Bazin has stressed the importance of early theologians in the 13th century. That in fact they read Avicenna. Avicenna was, in some sense, the philosopher, because the materials that they had of Aristotle were rather incoherent because of the translations of James of Venice. And they didn't, and who the heck knows how to read Aristotle anyway? And they're trying to read Aristotle's Metaphysics as a continuous treatise. Whoa, that's crazy. And so who was the philosopher? It was Avicenna. It was Avicenna, who guided them with a well-reasoned argument in the De Anima and in the Metaphysics as well. So, and then they didn't have a good text of the Metaphysics or the De Anima as such. And then on comes Averroes, who gives them a full text of each of those with a detailed commentary, even if they don't like it. But Bazin's point is very well taken, that the early Christian theologians were saying, well, no, it can't. This active part of the intellect cannot be separate from us. We have to be the individuals we are. And there's an Augustinian reason for doing that, but other reasons as well. So they put forward the notion that each individual has his or her own individual power, active power in this. And then Albert furthered that and put into Aquinas the results of his own work in this. But I want to stress this, that in spite of what people say, that Aristotle's obvious, and Aquinas is saying it's obvious what he means, Aquinas' account was novel. And it was not Aristotelian. Just assert it, it's not Aristotelian. What more Aristotelian account is what the Arabic tradition, following the Greek tradition, provided. So reading all these people, one really has to contextualize what they're working with. And this time, Traci, thanks for this. This time, just almost overwhelmed me with the way in which Aquinas is using the various principles that he has already established for himself, as if he has fully established them and made a fool of Averroes. But as I've often said to graduate students in seminars, if you're sitting in a room alone and reading Plato, and you read something stupid, there is someone stupid in the room, and Plato is never stupid. So all these people are brilliant thinkers, and no one is a fool. And maybe they're interpreters in Paris. Interpreters of Averroes in Paris are to some extent, but there are solid reasons for what Averroes does, and I'm not saying they're correct, but there are solid reasons for it in his context. Solid reasons for Avicenna as well, and solid reasons for Thomas, because he's already settled earlier on the definition of the various principles as they're involved. And that's the way to unpack it. So, and I do have an article where I say that this doesn't, Aquinas' unpacking does not properly meet with the issues that are in Averroes as well. So, but no doubt Stephen might have something to say.
All right, everyone, I think we're out of time for today, but let's thank our speakers once more.